So I am Dr. Jack Goldstein. I am the instructional designer for the Communication Lab, and my primary role is to develop and lead these trainings. So we start every training with an opening discussion. And in this case, congrats, you're a COM fellow. Now what? So I'm going to ask you a series of questions, starting with, what do you think is the difference between tutoring and coaching? What principles do you already know about effective coaching? And what do you want to know about coaching? Do you have any concerns or worries? So please take a couple minutes to discuss this with a partner and then move on. So now I'm going to show you a video of an actual coaching session. So as you're watching this, keep in mind, what coaching decisions do you notice in this excerpt?
All right. Yeah, I mean, you can read it if you want, but basically, I think my biggest problem is like the beginning, because I started just saying like all the things that I find cool in science, but I think maybe it's supposed to be a little more concrete than that.
Okay. Cool. So we're gonna go over beginning. Concrete. All right. What else are you concerned about for your statement of purpose?
I think so. My main reason for I want to kind of go into the area of systems bio.
Okay.
And I think my main reason was just that I really liked my classes that were related.
Cool.
But I feel like that's not as strong because I haven't done research in
the
area.
Okay. So it sounds like you're maybe potentially struggling with connecting your current experiences to what you want to do in grad school. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay. So making that link explicit. Okay.
Yeah, and I guess just generally knowing whether this is supposed to be explaining why I'm interested or explaining why I'm good for them, or both.
Okay. Yeah. So talking about kind of the match and the balance between that. Cool. All right. So that sounds like great things. I'm going to take 5 minutes to read through your document.
Sure.
If you have something to work on, and then we'll make a game plan for that. Okay. Cool. So first of all, great job. You clearly have put a ton of work into this so far. Let's talk about a couple things. So I think the first thing that you touched on is kind of the match and balance. So we'll talk about kind of how the match paragraph works and then ways you can potentially make it a little stronger.
Mm-hmm.
Let's also talk about quantifying your experiences, interpreting. I feel like you do a good job of describing the experiences, but could go into more depth into connecting the skills that you learned. So we'll talk about that. And then we have a couple of specific nitpicky things that we'll through if we have time. Okay, so let's actually first start with the interpreting and quantifying results. So one thing that I noticed is right here. This is your main research paragraph, right? This is all of your skills. What can you talk me through? What was the biggest takeaway that you had from the Chung Lab, for example? Can you talk me through if you had to quantify or put numbers on things that you did in that lab? How would you do that, or your role?
So that one was kind of hard because it was a course 9 lab.
Okay.
It was my first year up, but I think I had to work a lot independently.
Okay.
But things also failed a lot.
Cool. So you learned how to work independently.
Yeah.
Okay. And cope with failure. Which are super important for grad school.
I got some flexibility in designing experiments because at one point the grad student who was in charge of me left, so then it was just undergrads in charge of the project.
That's super cool. It's one of your first year up thing.
Yeah. Cool. But there weren't any good results that came out of it. The project kind of died.
Okay, so I'm hearing that you feel there's not clear things to quantify, but I like the things that you just told me, where it was learning independence, coping with failure, flexibility, and designing experiments. Mm-hmm. How do you think you can weave those into this section?
So I guess instead of saying why the research is important, say more make it more personal to me.
Yeah. Okay. Potentially.
Okay, so what decisions do you notice in this excerpt? Please take a few minutes to discuss this with your partner, and then we'll move on. So with that video in mind, by the end of your training, we hope that you'll feel comfortable with communication coaching. So that involves treating clients with professionalism, identifying clients' goals, prioritizing goals and strategically allocating time, encouraging client engagement, and leveraging CommLab policies and resources. But we also aim for you to feel comfortable with technical and career communication. So this involves aligning goals, audience, and message, proposing strong take-home messages, selecting and organizing evidence and reasoning, connecting technical work to a compelling motivation, using clear prose and visual design to minimize cognitive load, and speaking about technical work. And this is over written, visual, and verbal formats. So these learning objectives aren't for you to memorize, but they're more of a guide to help you anticipate what the rest of the trainings will cover. And this training series is the work of many minds. So we want to acknowledge both present and former CommLab staff in their development. So for the rest of the training, we are going to start by talking about the CommLab's coaching framework. We'll then get into some scenario practice and peer coaching your bios, and we'll wrap up with talking about coaching policies and support. So the CommLab's motto is that great coaches don't have all the answers, but great coaches ask great questions. And this motto incorporates 3 principles. The first is just in time, meaning that clients are going to come receive coaching when they need it, when an assignment is due, when a poster is due, when an application is due. And just in time, coaches then provide just the right information that's relevant to that paper or poster or assignment. And that information is going to be provided in just the right way. And this means that the coach isn't going to do the work, the client will. And that's because we learn best by doing and struggling. So our job as coaches is to help clients engage meaningfully with their work, to improve the client and not the document. The client does the work, and we say silence is beautiful because coaches can then help establish a space where that silence is allowed and clients can work and grow. We also take a whole person approach to coaching, which means that we consider a person's needs and if their needs are being met or unmet. So to illustrate this, this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where at the very bottom, the most fundamental need is one of survival. It's a physiological need for air, food, drink, shelter, sleep. Not always easy things to come by in grad school. And then there's security, so safety through order and predictability. There's social belonging, so friendship, intimacy, trust, acceptance. Self-esteem, that's self-worth and respect, a sense of one's own accomplishment. And then success through self-actualization, which is the realization of a person's potential. We cannot learn if our basic needs are not being met. So as a coach, it's going to be your role to meet a client where they're at and help determine what needs they have. So this starts by taking a customer service attitude and asking the client how they're doing. And not in a, how are you? Fine, okay, great kind of way, but really, like, how are you doing? Do you need to take a breath? Do you need to use the bathroom before we get started? Do you want something to drink? Sit next to the client. Offer them a snack. All the CommLabs are stocked with snacks. And you're going to offer the highest level of professionalism while continuing to speak with them and be approachable. So now I want to get into the outline of a standard coaching session. So you saw this demonstrated in the video, but we're going to go into an overview and then get into more depth. So the first couple minutes are introductions and getting oriented. The next few minutes are a review of the materials and identifying priorities. We sometimes call this triage. And then is the bulk of the coaching session, followed up with a wrap up and next steps to transition out the coaching session. So let's look at these in more depth. Introductions. It's the first minute, but it's an important first impression. And so your job as a coach is to try to match your client or meet them at a reasonable midpoint in terms of their energy and their emotions. So this can be offering a firm handshake, offering them eye contact, showing them that you see them, and then giving them an elevator pitch about what to expect in getting oriented. And so you can establish expectations by asking questions like, what are we working on today? And how would you like to spend our time together? Ask about your communication needs, like who are you writing this for? And what are your goals for this communication? And ask about their timeline. So where are you in the writing process? When is this due? Do you have any guidelines we should look at? Are there PI or audience expectations that we should keep in mind? So this is not an exhaustive list, but some potential questions to ask to get oriented. And then after introductions and orientation, it's time to review and prioritize or triage the work. So for fellows, you are not required to look at material before the coaching session. So now this is your time to get familiar with it. So you can say something like, I need 5 minutes or so to read or reread your document if it's a return client. It's often helpful if we can compare takeaways afterwards. So would you like some suggestions for reviewing your document while I review it as well? And I want to point to this last part because there's an explicit ask for consent before offering feedback or suggestions. And while the client is most likely just going to say, yes, they would like some suggestions, explicitly asking for consent allows the client to opt in and really promotes that sense of engagement and co-working on this. So some suggestions for what a client can do while you're reviewing. If they come in with just some general questions about their work, you can say, write 3 strengths and 3 weaknesses of your draft. If they come in trying to get help with their message, you can suggest write the purpose next to each paragraph, or create a diagram of your main ideas and how they're connected, or write the elevator pitch you'd use to introduce your work. If they're coming in for help with how different pieces are connected and the flow, you can suggest underline each paragraph's main idea. Ask where the main idea is typically positioned within paragraphs. Is there a logical connection from each of your paragraphs, poster panels, figures to the next? Or perhaps they come in with wanting to finesse an abstract or really get into the wording. So you can suggest circle all the jargon in the document or think about the ways that you can quantify each of your experiences. Now, as you're reviewing the document, remember the coaching guide for any task. And this is going to be covered in every coaching session, which is asking the client, who is the client's audience and why are they communicating to the audience in this way? Why are they making the poster? Why are they submitting the application? And these are essential to understand before getting into what the take-home message is, which is essential to understand before how the narrative is structured, what the visuals are, how the delivery is going to be synergistic. And so these may be covered or not depending on the needs of the client. So after reviewing the document, or the communication product, aim to identify, prioritize themes that you think should be worked on. These are 1 to 3 themes, like the biggest bang for the buck. And when you identify themes to cover, then is the opportunity to debrief with the client and compare what the client had for their takeaways. If they are the same, then you can move on working on what's agreed upon. If what you took away as a theme to cover is different than what the client took away from a theme to cover, then there's an opportunity for discussion where, as a coach, you can say, okay, so this is what I noticed. What did you notice? What do we want to focus on? Besides those 1 to 3 themes, you can also notice things to discuss if there's time, and then things not needed to be discussed at all. So for example, let's say that your client brings you this page written in Latin. So some themes that you might focus on are topic sentences, which are the point of each paragraph, what jargon you see, the motivation or impact for the work, the overall structure of the work, and then what examples are present. So let's say as you are reading through this document, you've noticed that what really stands out to you is the amount of jargon in the document, and say perhaps what's motivating the document. So then this is what you would bring to the coaching session. You would use that to develop an agenda with your client through a series of observational statements, feedback, and questions. Starting with observation. So in the case of jargon, you might say something like, I noticed that there are many words in here that I don't understand. And then there's some direct feedback, which talks about the impact of that. So I find this confusing, so I'm having trouble identifying then what your main message is. That direct feedback is then followed by an open question. So in this case, what is it that you want the audience to understand? And then once the client tells you that, you can reflect back what you've heard. Okay, so you want the audience to understand XYZ, and then you can explore solutions. Where starting with consent, you ask, okay, do you want to explore solutions together for, say, clearing up this jargon? Great. Is there a different way that you can say this? Now, notice that we've already spent maybe like 15 minutes of our coaching session, not yet coaching, but introductions, getting oriented, establishing expectations, and then having this observation, direct feedback, open-ended questions. Now notice that we've spent the first 15 minutes of the coaching session not coaching yet. We've gone through our introductions and orientations, we've reviewed and prioritized, and now we're developing an agenda. So all of this is set up to really make sure that we understand what the client's needs are, we understand what their goals are, and that we can help them align their message with their goals and their needs. So here are some more examples of how to balance direct comments with open-ended questions. A direct comment might be something like, I found this part confusing. And the follow-up open question could be, so what will your audience already know? Or perhaps, I couldn't tell what your main message is here. And the open-ended question is, what one thing do you want your audience to remember? Perhaps I can't find your topic sentence. And so the open question is, what is this paragraph about? And you can make positive comments too, like, great word choice, so clear and concise. But there's still an open-ended question. How are you feeling about it? So notice that in the direct comments, these are mostly I statements. So as a coach, communicating your experiential feedback is going to be the most authentic thing that isn't going to project your own experience on to others. So rather than saying other people might find this confusing, I found this confusing. Instead of saying, they might not be able to tell what your main message is, I couldn't tell what your main message is. So it's authentic, it's present, and it will allow you to have the most personable conversation with the client. And notice for the open-ended, these are not questions that the client could answer with 1 or 2 words. They require the client to step back and think and process, and in many cases, come up with their own answer. Now, as you're coaching, try to distinguish best practices from personal choices. So for example, something everyone should do is avoid yellow text on a white background. It's really hard to read. But something that you might prefer might be whether something's left aligned or centered or the type of font. So for coaching, try to focus on the best practices that everyone or most people would do. And then towards the end of the coaching session, you'll wrap up and talk about next steps, depending on the time. So a time check, about 10 minutes before, you can ask the client, how are you feeling about your goals for this session? Is there anything that we missed? And then a few minutes before the end, do you know what your next steps are? Let's write them down. Shall we book your next appointment? So given that entire coaching framework, there's a quick reference for the entire coaching session outline in a coaching checklist. Now let's put these coaching structures to work in a scenario practice. So you are going to role play these scenarios where in each group, one pair of fellows is going to role play a client scenario for about 3 minutes. The client is going to role play based on one of the 3 prompts that you received. Keep the prompt to yourself, but you can improvise. For the coach, do your best to coach this client in a realistic way. And feel free to refer to your coaching checklist as often as you need. If there's an observer, what kind of client did you see? What did the coach do well? And after that 3 minutes in debrief, we'll switch so another pair of fellows can also role play and debrief. So with that, now you're going to get a chance to coach each other on the bios that you brought in. So in pairs, you'll coach each other for about 5 minutes. So for the client, think, what is it that you want to get out of this coaching session? For the coach, again, remember to apply the coaching guide and checklist as often as you need. And then we'll switch to another pair of fellows and role play and debrief. So remember your audience. What might attract clients and help them decide who to work with? So take some time to work on this with your partner, and then we'll move on. So now that you've had that practice, let's wrap up with going into some coaching policies and support. So please take a look at this list. And the question is, which of these situations are in scope for ConnLab appointments? So take a couple minutes. Here's what I said. Now the ones that are X'd out, number 2, perhaps a client says, I can't figure out what to work on for my master's thesis. It is not in a communication fellow's scope to help a client determine the direction of their thesis. And number 7 is X'd out. I think my argument in my history paper could be sharper because it is out of scope for communication fellows to work outside of STEM. Number 5 and number 6 are question marks because number 5 says, my TA told me my systems term paper reads like an email to a friend and I should make it more professional. So as a comm fellow, you can absolutely talk about professional communication with a client, but You're not going to be a line editor for an email. And number 6, my lit review seems like it should have more, but I'm not sure what else in the literature would be relevant. So as a comm fellow, you can absolutely help a client discuss their literature and how it relates to their research and how it relates to the kinds of questions they're asking, but it's out of scope for you to determine whether their literature search is enough or suggest any additional literature. So the comm lab appointment policies are intended to protect your time and well-being. So some examples of comm lab policies are that sessions are 60 minutes or less in public spaces. Fellows do not need to prepare before sessions. Fellows do not replace TAs. And if you have frequent no-show clients, it's okay to suspend them from signing up. You can talk about these and more with your manager. Now, as you're having one-on-one appointments with clients, you are on the front line as a coach, but you're not alone. So in the very rare case that you have some sort of problematic appointment with a client, first of all, contact your manager always, except in the most egregious cases where you can contact the manager afterwards. So some examples, on the low side of egregiousness, the client seems to have misunderstood the role of a comm lab. They bring you a history paper. Or perhaps you know a client and they don't appear to be themselves. Maybe they stopped showering or they're in an unusual mood. We all go through areas of stress, and it's not necessarily something to be concerned about, but something to bring up with your manager if you notice. Maybe a client was in tears, or the client talks about not getting along with their PI and it's affecting their work. Or maybe, unfortunately, the client reports a case of sexual harassment in the department. All things to talk about with your manager. In the most egregious case that a client is planning to hurt themselves or others, call 911 and then loop in your managers later. Now, as fellows, you're not responsible employees under Title IX, which is federal law banning gender discrimination and sexual harassment within educational institutions. That means that you're not legally required to report any such incidences to the MIT Title IX office, but do loop in your managers after an unusual coaching session. Use the client's name only if they've given you permission, but once you hand off that communication to your manager, that's it. Your fellow responsibility ends once a staff member has received that information. So to wrap up, I want to orient you to what's coming up next. So after coaching best practices will be communication best practices. And then we'll focus more on career communication through applications and interviews, and then statements of purpose and research proposals. We'll get into visual communication through slides and posters. And then technical writing, first through planning and organization, and then through writing prose. In February, we'll have our workshop design training, which we call our workshop, which is for anyone who is interested in designing a workshop or some other comm lab event. And then we'll end with oral and real-time communication, focusing on presentation skills and networking. Now, in late May, each of your managers will check in with you about getting started. This means having a photo and revised bio on the website, having shadowed 2 client sessions or been coached yourself, and set up and trained in the coaching calendar WC online. And you feel ready or enough, and you will be a great coach and you'll be learning the entire way. So thank you. And I ask that you go and give us some feedback on this training. There's just a couple of questions. They're going to be anonymous, but your feedback will help us improve this training for future fellows. Thank you.